The early morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the small, quiet farm where Clara Miller lived. Clara had been a widow for 2 years, and in that time, she had managed to build a life for herself on the wide, empty land she had moved to. She wasn't rich, nor was she particularly skilled in many things. But Clara was strong and determined. She had come to the frontier, like many others, hoping to start fresh. Life on the frontier was tough. The soil was hard, and the weather was unpredictable. Still, Clara found peace in the daily routines of farm life, tending to her small garden, feeding her chickens, and fixing things around her little cabin. The quiet of the land suited her well, and although she sometimes felt lonely, it was a loneliness she had learned to live with. There were no distractions out here, no bustling town to visit or many people to talk to. It was just her and the land. One cool morning in early autumn, as Clara was carrying a bucket of water from the well, she noticed someone riding toward her from the distance. It was a tall figure, with broad shoulders and a strong build. Clara paused and squinted, trying to make out who it was. As the person drew closer, she recognized him. It was Gideon Stark, the giant rancher who owned the largest cow ranch in the area. Clara had heard of Gideon Stark. In fact, everyone in town had heard of him. He was known for being a man of few words, a hard worker, and a successful rancher. Some people said he was difficult to get along with, that he was rough around the edges. Others said he was kind and generous in his own way. But one thing was clear: he was not a man who often asked for help. Gideon's ranch was the biggest in the area. It stretched for miles, with fields of crops and thousands of cattle. His workers were tough, just like him, and they did whatever it took to keep the ranch running smoothly. It was said that Gideon rarely ventured into town and only spoke to others when absolutely necessary. For someone like Clara, who kept to herself most of the time, the idea of having any interaction with someone like Gideon seemed distant and unlikely. But now, here he was, riding toward her on horseback. The sound of his horse's hooves crunching the dirt was the only sound. That broke the silence of the morning. Clara couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She had no idea what he wanted, but whatever it was, she had a feeling it was something important. Gideon came to a stop in front of Clara, looking down at her from his horse. His eyes were kind, though they seemed to study her carefully, like he was trying to figure something out. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "Can you pretend to be my cook for a week?" His voice was deep, almost gravelly, but there was a softness to it that Clara hadn't expected. "My regular cook took ill, and I need someone to fill in. Just for a week. I'll pay you." Clara stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what he had just said. She had never been a cook. Sure, she could cook a simple meal for herself, a stew, maybe, or some bread, but she had never cooked for a group of people, let alone a whole ranch full of hungry workers. The idea seemed impossible. "I'm not much of a cook," Clara said, stammering a little. Her words caught in her throat. She felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I mean, I know how to cook simple things, but I've never cooked for a group like that. I don't think I could do it." Gideon didn't seem bothered by her hesitation. Instead, he gave a small smile, the corners of his mouth twitching up ever so slightly. It was a smile that made him look less like a giant rancher and more like a man who understood the challenges of the frontier. Someone who had struggled in his own way and knew that people could surprise themselves if given the chance. "It's not about being fancy," he said, his tone calm and reassuring. "It's about feeding a crew. They just need something hot and filling. If you can cook a simple meal, you can do this." Clara wasn't sure what to think. On one hand, the idea of working for someone like Gideon seemed overwhelming. He was a rancher with a reputation, and she was just a small farmer who had barely learned to get by. But on the other hand, the idea of earning some money was tempting. She didn't have much saved up, and the long winters were always a struggle. A week of work, even as a cook, would be a good opportunity to make some extra cash. "Well, I suppose I could try," Clara said, though she still wasn't entirely sure. "But if the food isn't good, don't blame me. I've never cooked for so many people." Gideon gave another small smile. and this time it seemed warmer, as though he appreciated her honesty. "Don't worry about it. Just come by the ranch this afternoon, and we'll figure it out. The crew's used to a no-frills meal, so you'll be fine." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Clara standing in the morning sunlight, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? Later that afternoon, Clara found herself walking toward Gideon's ranch. The ranch was even larger than she had imagined. There were long fields stretching as far as she could see, with cattle grazing lazily on the grass. The ranch house itself was a large, wooden building, its windows reflecting the bright afternoon sun. A few workers were moving about, tending to the animals and the crops, but it was quieter than Clara had expected. When she reached the door of the ranch house, she hesitated for a moment before knocking. She wasn't sure what to expect once she stepped inside. Would they laugh at her lack of experience? Would Gideon be disappointed in her? But when the door opened, it wasn't as frightening as she had imagined. Gideon stood there, as calm and steady as ever, looking down at her with a friendly expression. "Come in, Clara," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I'll show you the kitchen." Inside, the house was large but comfortable. There were wooden floors, warm fires burning in the hearths, and the smell of the open air mixed with the scent of the wood and leather. Clara couldn't help but be impressed. This was not the small cabin she was used to. It was a space meant for work and rest, designed to keep people comfortable during the long days of hard labor. Gideon led her to the kitchen, a room that was surprisingly well equipped. There were pots and pans hanging from the walls, spices and ingredients neatly arranged on shelves, and a large, sturdy stove with a stack of firewood next to it. Everything seemed to be in its place, ready to be used. "The crew needs their meals," Gideon said, his voice practical. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. Just keep it simple and don't worry too much. They'll eat anything." Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely determined. She might not have been a cook, but if she could figure out how to feed herself on her own little farm, she could figure this out. Too, she had no choice but to give it her best shot. As the door to the kitchen closed behind her, Clara took a deep breath. She wasn't sure if she could succeed, but there was one thing she knew for certain: this was an opportunity. It might not be what she had planned for her life, but in this new world, opportunities were rare, and she couldn't afford to let this one slip away. So, with a deep breath, Clara prepared to begin her week as Gideon Stark's temporary cook. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun, just as the chill of early autumn crept into the air. The sky outside her window was a pale blue, and a soft mist clung to the earth. She had spent the night in a small room within the ranch house, the quiet hum of the night only broken by the distant sounds of the ranchers, preparing for another busy day. Clara wasn't used to waking up so early. Back home, on her own farm, she would rise with the sun, but this was different. She had agreed to work on Gideon's ranch, and now, as she dressed and prepared herself for the day, she felt the weight of her decision. She wasn't sure what exactly she was getting herself into, but she knew one thing: she had to give it her best shot. The kitchen was already bustling when Clara arrived. The ranch hands had begun their work early, their boots stomping the dirt outside, and the sound of horses whinnying could be heard in the distance. Clara stepped inside, her heart racing. The kitchen, though large and well-equipped, felt intimidating in the early morning light. It was nothing like the small stove she had back at home. Here, there were bigger pots, bigger tools, and so many ingredients she had never used before. Gideon, as usual, was calm and steady. He didn't give her a lot of direction, but instead trusted her to find her way. "You've got this," he said quietly, before turning to leave her to her work. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking round at the shelves and counters stacked with ingredients. There were bags of flour, jars of pickled vegetables, dry meats hanging from the ceiling, and bags of beans. There were also large crates of fresh produce that had been picked that morning: potatoes, onions, carrots, and squash. A huge pot of water simmered on the stove, waiting to be turned into something hearty and filling. For a moment, Clara hesitated. Cooking for a large group of men was a far cry from her usual meals. which consisted of simple bread, stew, and the occasional roasted chicken. But this was different. These were ranch hands, men who worked hard all day long in the sun. They needed food that would keep them full and energized for the long hours ahead. Clara took a deep breath and began. She chopped potatoes and carrots, peeled onions, and started a fire under a large pot of water. She added salt, pepper, and dried herbs she had never heard of, hoping they would give the dish a bit of flavor. As she worked, she couldn't help but think back to her first day on the farm, when she had barely known how to plant a seed. That had been a new beginning too, and look where she was now, surviving, learning, and making it through on her own. By midday, the smell of the stew had filled the kitchen, and Clara was beginning to feel more confident in her cooking. The ranch hands slowly filed into the kitchen, wiping the sweat from their brows and loosening their belts after a long morning of hard work. Gideon was among the first to sit at the long wooden table. His usual quiet presence was even more noticeable in the kitchen, where he didn't speak much but observed with a steady gaze. The men dug into their meals, some of them talking in low voices, others too hungry to say anything at all. Clara watched them for a moment, her heart racing as they ate. Was it good? Did they like it? Was it enough? She couldn't tell, but she didn't dare ask. She just stood there, waiting for the inevitable response. One of the ranch hands looked up at her, his mouth full of food. "This is good," he said, his eyes bright with approval. "Better than what the last cook made, that's for sure." Clara felt a rush of relief wash over her. It wasn't the best meal she had ever made, but it was enough. It was enough to keep them fed, enough to fill their bellies. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel proud of her work. The days went by quickly after that, each one blending into the next as Clara fell into a routine. She would wake early to prepare the meals, chopping vegetables and simmering stews. The ranch hands were a mix of rough, tough men, but they were kind to her, especially once they tasted her food. They never complained, never criticized. They just ate, worked, and went about their business. Some of them would offer little compliments, like how well the potatoes were cooked or how the bread had just the right amount of crunch. The small praise meant a lot to Clara, who had never cooked for anyone outside of her own quiet home. But it wasn't just the men's approval that Clara found herself appreciating. It was the unexpected camaraderie. Each night, as the workday ended, the ranch hands would gather in the dining room, sitting at long wooden tables, laughing and talking about the day's events. Gideon, always the quiet one, would join them, though he never said much, but he would listen, nodding along as the others spoke. Clara was always amazed at how these men, so tough and so used to hard work, could still find moments of joy in their lives. It reminded her of her own quiet moments back on her farm, when she would sit by the fire and listen to the sounds of the night. By the end of the week, Clara felt as though she had become a part of the ranch's daily life. She had learned to cook meals that were simple but satisfying, and she had gained a deeper understanding of the work that went into running such a large operation. She had also learned a little about the men who worked for Gideon, how they came from all walks of life, but had found a place at the ranch because of their hard work and grit. She saw how Gideon treated them with respect, even if he didn't speak much. On the last day of her week at the ranch, Clara had prepared a large meal for the crew beef stew, biscuits, and roasted vegetables. She was feeling a little sad to leave, though she wasn't sure why. The week had been long and hard, but it had been rewarding in ways she hadn't expected. She had earned money, yes, but she had also gained something more confidence in herself and her abilities. Gideon came into the kitchen just as Clara was finishing the meal. He stood there for a moment, watching her as she added the final touches to the stew. "You did good work, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "The men are happy, and you didn't complain once." Clara smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I told you I could do it," he nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "I didn't doubt you." The meal that evening was filled with laughter and conversation, as the ranch hands dug into the food with the usual hunger of men who had worked hard all day. But tonight, there was something different in the air, and unspoken understanding that Clara had done more than just cook a meal. She had become part of their lives, part of their rhythm. And for the first time since she had arrived on the ranch, Clara felt truly at home. As the evening wound down and the last of the dishes were washed, Clara stood outside the kitchen, gazing up at the stars. She felt proud of herself, proud of the work she had done. Gideon had kept his word, paying her for the week, and as he handed her the pouch of coins, he offered one last piece of advice. "If you ever need work again, come by," he said. "You're welcome here." Clara took the money and smiled. It wasn't just about the money, though it was about knowing she could do more than she had ever believed. As she walked back to her cabin, she realized that this week had taught her something important. She was stronger than she had thought, and the frontier, with all its challenges, was a place where she could carve out a future. One meal at a time,